I had never pictured my life veering so sharply off course the day I submitted my application to Apex Innovations, a name that loomed over the tech industry like an untouchable empire. I had just graduated. My business administration degree clutched like a fragile promise, and desperation pushed me toward anything that resembled a beginning. An entry-level role, a foot in the door, a chance to exist in a world that felt impossibly far from the quiet life I had known. The interview began simply enough. A long table, a row of unreadable faces, questions fired with precision. They dissected my ambitions, tested my confidence, weighed my worth as if I were already part of something larger than myself. I answered the way I had rehearsed countless times in front of a mirror, steady voice masking the storm beneath my ribs. When it ended, I expected nothing. Rejection felt safer, more familiar. Instead, I was accepted. Not just accepted, but placed somewhere I hadn't dared to imagine. Personal assistant to the CEO, Elena Voss. Her name carried a reputation that echoed through every hallway and whispered conversation. People spoke of her like she was less a person and more a force. Cold, exacting, untouchable. The kind of woman who built empires without ever raising her voice, who commanded fear and admiration in equal measure. While waiting for my orientation, I found myself staring at her photo on the company website longer than I should have. Sharp features carved with precision, eyes that seemed to see through glass and bone, dark hair cascading like something out of a dream. It stirred something unfamiliar in me, something I quickly tried to bury. My first day inside the skyscraper felt like stepping into another reality. Everything gleamed: glass, steel, ambition. Even the silence felt expensive. The elevator ride stretched endlessly, each passing floor tightening the knot in my chest. When the doors finally opened, the atmosphere shifted. People moved quickly, spoke less, avoided lingering. It felt like her presence existed even when she wasn't in the room. My desk sat just outside her office, positioned near a window that overlooked the city like a kingdom. It was a view that made my small apartment feel like a distant memory. Carla, the woman assigned to train me, wasted no time softening the truth. Perfection was not optional. Mistakes were not tolerated. Elena Voss did not forgive. When Carla left, the quiet settled heavily. I adjusted my oversized blazer, feeling the tight pull of the bandages wrapped around my chest. It was a habit I had carried for years, a shield against attention I never wanted, a way to make myself smaller, safer. My life had always been about control, about staying hidden in a world that didn't quite understand me. Desire had always lived quietly inside me, untouched, unspoken. Until the first time I saw Elena in person, everything shifted. She entered like a storm contained in human form, her presence sharp and undeniable. Her tailored suit fit her like it had been designed around her power. She didn't waste time on introductions or pleasantries. Her voice was calm, direct, carrying authority that demanded obedience without effort. Tasks spilled from her lips in rapid succession, and I scrambled to keep up, pen barely steady in my hand. Standing that close to her felt overwhelming. The faint trace of her perfume lingered in the air, something soft beneath the steel of her presence. It made my thoughts blur, my focus slip. When she dismissed me with a small gesture, I caught myself staring, drawn to the effortless grace in the way she moved. The realization hit quickly, sharp and unwelcome. I forced myself back into reality. Burying it under work, days turned into a relentless rhythm. Emails, schedules, calls, endless details that demanded perfection. Every small mistake earned a cold correction that burned long after it was spoken. Yet beneath the pressure, admiration grew quietly. She was everything people said she was. Brilliant, unshakable, untouchable. Stories about her floated through the office like legends. Deals worth billions. Decisions that shaped the company's future. A mind that never seemed to falter. To everyone else, she was intimidating. To me, she became something more complicated. Something distant and magnetic, like a star that could never be reached but was impossible to ignore. I stumbled often in her presence. Words tangled, thoughts scattered, small signs of my inexperience slipping through despite my efforts to appear composed. At home, in the quiet of my room, I replayed every interaction, every glance, every word. It became a habit I couldn't break. Each morning the bandages went on again, tight and familiar, a routine of concealment. A reminder of the version of myself I showed the world. But something had already begun to shift beneath it. There were moments, small, almost insignificant, that stayed with me. Fetching her usual coffee, hands unsteady as I passed it to her. The brief pause of her gaze lingering just a second too long. Watching her in meetings, commanding the room without effort, every word precise, every movement controlled. It was impossible not to be drawn in. My world narrowed quickly. Long hours replaced everything else. Messages from friends went unanswered. Nights blurred into work, exhaustion settling deep in my bones. Yet even in isolation, my thoughts drifted back to her, always her. I told myself it was nothing. Just admiration, just proximity. She was my boss, a figure far above anything I could ever reach. But the feeling didn't fade. It grew, quiet and persistent, threading itself through every part of my routine. One afternoon, in the stillness of the company library, I felt it again. Her presence before I even saw her. A simple comment about my choice of reading turned into a brief exchange, her intelligence cutting and effortless. It left me both inspired and painfully aware of the distance between us. Back at my desk, I couldn't focus. The moment replayed over and over, embedding itself deeper than it should have. I was nothing like her. Soft where she was sharp, uncertain where she was absolute. And yet, something kept pulling me closer. Work became my anchor. Every completed task felt like progress, like proof that I belonged there, and occasionally there were cracks in her composure, a nod of approval, a subtle shift in her expression. Small things that felt like victories. By the end of the first month, exhaustion had become constant, but so had determination. My life had transformed into something unrecognizable. The quiet student I once was had been replaced by someone navigating a world of pressure, power, and something far more dangerous beneath the surface. Late one night, standing alone with the city lights stretching endlessly below, the realization settled in. This was only the beginning. And somewhere beneath the ambition, the fear, and the relentless pace, something else had begun to awaken. The office became a world that only existed after dark, a place where silence stretched endlessly, and the glow of screens replaced everything human. In those late hours, when the noise of the day faded, I became painfully aware of how untouched my life had been. No soft confessions, no lingering embraces, no stolen moments that belonged to anyone but me. Just quiet longing, carefully hidden, now taking shape around one person I could never have. A rare crack in that relentless routine came after I delivered a flawless presentation draft. Elena's approval was never easily earned, never freely given, which made the moment feel almost unreal. She glanced at me, her voice softer than I had ever heard it, her eyes holding mine just a second longer than necessary. She acknowledged my growth, simple words carrying more weight than anything extravagant. It lingered, long after she turned away, a quiet spark that warmed something deep inside me before the flood of responsibilities returned and swallowed it whole. The exhaustion of constant demands pressed heavily, yet being near her carried its own strange energy. It was a contradiction I couldn't escape. Drained and alive at the same time, surrounded by people yet deeply alone. That loneliness sharpened during a team dinner I had carefully arranged, watching her effortlessly become the center of attention. Her laughter, rare and fleeting, felt almost like a reward for those lucky enough to hear it. From the edges of the room, I observed, something unfamiliar twisting in my chest as others tried to win her attention. She dismissed them with the same composed distance she showed the world, yet it did little to quiet the feeling building inside me. Back in the office, everything returned to its strict structure. Roles remained defined, boundaries clear, but my thoughts no longer obeyed those lines. They drifted, wandered into places I tried not to acknowledge. The pressure I kept wrapped tightly around myself began to feel heavier, the physical restraint across my chest mirroring everything I refused to confront. Still, I endured it, telling myself it was necessary, that discipline and distance were the only things keeping me grounded. One evening, rain lashed against the windows, turning the city into a blur of light and shadow. I stayed behind, finishing reports in the quiet hum of the empty floor. When Elena stepped out of her office, coat draped over her arm, her presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. Instead of leaving, she directed me to walk through the building with her, reviewing operations in a way that felt less like instruction and more like something shared. The empty floors echoed with her voice as she spoke about the company, her vision, the precision behind every decision. There was a depth to her passion that rarely surfaced in crowded meetings. Walking beside her in that stillness, I found myself listening more than understanding, drawn not just to her words but to the way she carried them. My own responses felt small, almost naive, but she didn't dismiss them. That alone made the moment linger, something warm tucked quietly inside a world that rarely allowed softness. Weeks passed, blending into one another, and the isolation grew heavier with each day. Yet so did the pull. Every thought seemed to circle back to her, every quiet moment filled with the same unspoken awareness. It became impossible to ignore that this place, this job, was changing me in ways I had never prepared for. Overtime blurred into routine. The office no longer felt temporary. It became a second home defined by artificial light and constant pressure. Her expectations evolved, growing sharper, more complex, drawing me deeper into responsibilities that demanded everything I had. Calls, reports, strategies. Each task pulled me further away from anything resembling a life outside those walls. People noticed the hours I kept, the way I remained long after everyone else had gone, but I brushed it aside. There was something about being close to her world, even in exhaustion, that felt worth it. Even when it left me isolated, even when it hollowed out everything else. Small moments continued to slip through. A shared ride to a partner firm, her focus steady on the road while conversation drifted between strategy and something lighter. The brief sound of her laughter at something awkward I said lingered far longer than it should have, a rare glimpse of something unguarded. Then came the chaos of a crisis, a leak that threatened everything, forcing the office into overnight damage control. Surrounded by files and urgency, I worked until thought itself felt heavy. Even then, my mind wandered back to the same emptiness I had always carried, the same quiet yearning that had never found an outlet. Her command during that storm only deepened the image everyone already held of her. Unshakable, precise, feared and admired all at once. I watched from the background, drawn in further, caught between awe and something far more personal. Rumors about her life drifted through the break room one afternoon. Always alone, always distant. It only fed the impossible narratives forming in my mind, fantasies I knew had no place in reality. Still, they remained, persistent and unrelenting. One evening stretched longer than most, the weight of a critical report pressing down as the office slowly emptied. The city darkened outside, reflections stretching across the glass walls. I stayed, as always, buried in work, aware of her presence even when I couldn't see her. When she finally stepped out, her presence cut cleanly through the silence. She reviewed the report beside me, close enough that the faint scent of her perfume filled the space between us. It made concentration difficult, every sense sharpened in ways I couldn't control. Instead of leaving, she stayed. What followed felt different from the usual distance between us. Working side by side blurred something subtle, shifting the atmosphere into something quieter, more focused, yet undeniably charged. Her attention to detail, her precision, the way she explained without hesitation, it pulled me in completely. Fatigue crept in, but I refused to let it show. Time lost its structure as the night deepened. The city lights outside flickered like distant stars, the office shrinking into a space that felt separate from everything else. Small moments replayed in my mind, accidental brushes of hands, fleeting contact that lingered longer than logic allowed. Hours passed, and exhaustion finally began to show. She noticed. The shift in her tone was subtle, but it carried something unfamiliar, something almost gentle. It settled somewhere deep, far beyond the physical strain, touching a part of me that had never known what to do with a tension like that. The quiet wrapped around us completely, isolating us from everything beyond those walls. It made every thought louder, every feeling harder to ignore. Memories of my life before this surfaced. Simple, controlled, untouched. A life where everything had been carefully kept at a distance. Now that distance was collapsing. Without warning, she leaned back, tension finally showing in the way she pressed her fingers to her temples. The space felt too confined, too heavy with everything unspoken. A decision followed quickly, her voice returning to its usual composure, as she suggested continuing elsewhere, somewhere more suitable, more efficient. The shift from office to something personal happened faster than I could process. The drive through the rain-soaked city felt unreal, reflections of neon lights sliding across the windows as silence filled the space between us. I sat still, aware of every movement, every passing glance I stole without meaning to. She looked untouchable even in something as ordinary as this, composed in a way that made everything else feel distant. Her building rose into the night like something out of reach. The transition from public space to private world happened seamlessly, each step pulling me further into a reality I didn't belong to. The elevator ride felt endless, the quiet amplifying everything I refused to say. Inside, her penthouse felt like an entirely different world. Clean lines, soft lighting, expansive views stretching across the city. Everything reflected her, Controlled, refined, distant. It was beautiful in a way that made me feel small, out of place, yet unable to look away. We moved to her study, returning to the task at hand as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The environment shifted something subtle, making the space between us feel closer, more personal. Work resumed, but it no longer felt the same. The quiet luxury around us contrasted sharply with the sterile office I had grown used to. She moved through the room with the same effortless confidence, her presence commanding even in stillness. I followed her lead, focusing on the report, absorbing every instruction, every detail. The admiration I had tried to contain only deepened, growing into something more difficult to ignore. A small moment broke through again. A suggestion I made, something minor, something cautious. She paused, considered it, then acknowledged it with a brief approval that carried far more meaning than it should have. It stayed with me, a quiet warmth in the middle of everything else. The night stretched on, and exhaustion finally settled fully into my bones. Even as I tried to push through, the weight of it became impossible to ignore, my protests quiet and easily dismissed in the face of her focus, and still I stayed. "I'm going to take a bath and clear my head," she said, with effortless composure, rising as if the long night had barely touched her. The invitation that followed was casual, almost routine, an offer to use anything I needed, to make myself comfortable in a space that didn't belong to me. I nodded, returning my attention to the work in front of me, though my focus had already begun to slip. The thought lingered quietly at the edges of my mind. Being alone in her home carried a strange weight, both intimidating and quietly alluring. Everything around me spoke of a life far removed from mine. The soft hum of expensive appliances, the subtle elegance of every detail, the kind of comfort I had only ever imagined from a distance. It felt unreal, like stepping into a version of life I was never meant to touch. I worked through the final edits, pacing myself, trying to hold on to something steady while everything else shifted beneath the surface. The silence of the penthouse wrapped around me, thicker than the quiet of the office ever had. It wasn't empty. It felt charged, as if the walls themselves held on to her presence. The faint sound of running water reached me from somewhere deeper in the apartment, pulling my thoughts away from the screen. It was a simple reminder of her, of where I was, of how far removed this moment was from anything familiar. I finished the report with a slow exhale, saving the file as a small sense of relief settled in. For a moment I let myself wander, the space invited it. Soft fabrics beneath my fingertips, the quiet luxury of everything arranged with intention. I could almost picture her here alone. After long days, the sharp edges of her public persona softened in private. It made the distance between who she was to the world and who she might be beyond it feel smaller, more human. By the time she returned, the atmosphere had shifted again. She stepped back into the room composed, refreshed. The weight of the night eased from her expression. There was something subtly different in the way she carried herself now, something less guarded, though no less commanding. Her presence drew my attention immediately, and I had to force myself to look away, to steady the sudden rush of awareness. She told me to take a break, to clear my head, her tone leaving little room for hesitation. Exhaustion made the decision easier than it should have been. I gathered what I needed, moving toward a part of her world that felt far too personal, my pulse unsteady in a way I couldn't fully explain. The bathroom felt almost unreal. Every surface gleamed under soft lighting, every detail carefully chosen, nothing out of place. It wasn't just luxury, it was a kind of quiet control, an extension of who she was. I paused there for a moment, taking it in, before finally closing the door behind me. Alone, the silence felt different. The routine I carried every day, the layers, the restraint, the careful shaping of how I existed, began to loosen. Piece by piece, I let it go, standing there with nothing but my own reflection staring back at me. Vulnerability settled in slowly, unfamiliar yet undeniable. It wasn't just about being in her space. It was about facing parts of myself I had spent years keeping hidden. The warmth of the bath wrapped around me, easing tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was nothing to hold up, nothing to maintain. Just quiet, stillness, and thoughts I could no longer keep at a distance. They drifted back to her, moments replayed without permission. The closeness, the brief touches, the rare softness in her voice when she offered praise. Small things that had grown into something far larger in my mind. I sank deeper into the warmth, letting those thoughts exist without pushing them away, even if they unsettled me. Time slipped by unnoticed. When I finally stepped out, The world felt different somehow, like something subtle had shifted beneath the surface. I hesitated, considering whether to rebuild the layers I had always relied on, but exhaustion and something quieter held me back. For once, I let myself exist without them. The hallway was dim when I stepped out, the silence suggesting the night had moved on without me. I expected solitude, the comfort of being unseen again. But the moment I entered the living space, everything stilled. She was still there, her gaze lifted, meeting mine in a way that felt immediate and inescapable. For a second, neither of us moved. The air seemed to tighten, filled with something unspoken yet impossible to ignore. Awareness hit all at once, of where I stood, of how exposed I felt, of the distance that had just collapsed between us. Embarrassment rushed in, instinctive and overwhelming, my body reacting before my thoughts could catch up. Words came out uneven, an attempt to explain, to retreat, to restore something that had already shifted too far. But she didn't look away. Something in her expression changed, subtle but undeniable. The same control remained, but beneath it was something more focused, more intent. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, leaving no space for uncertainty. I moved closer without fully deciding to, drawn by something stronger than hesitation. Every step felt deliberate, every second stretching longer than it should. The space between us disappeared until it no longer felt like distance existed at all. Her presence was overwhelming at that proximity. Not harsh, not cold, just undeniably there. When she lifted her hand, the gesture was controlled, measured, yet it carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. My thoughts scattered, replaced by something quieter, something that felt both unfamiliar and deeply real. The world beyond that moment faded. The tension that had built slowly over weeks, hidden beneath routine and discipline, surfaced all at once. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was quiet, steady, undeniable. A shift from something distant into something personal. Something that could no longer be dismissed as imagination. Time lost its structure again. The night unfolded in a way that felt less like a sudden change, and more like something that had been building all along, waiting for the right moment to surface. The boundaries that had once felt absolute blurred into something softer, something undefined. When everything finally stilled, the silence that followed felt different from before. Not empty, not isolating. Just quiet in a way that allowed everything to settle. She remained close, her presence no longer distant or unreachable, but something real and immediate. The sharp edges that defined her in the outside world seemed softer here, less guarded. Her voice, when it came, carried a tone I hadn't heard before. Honest, unfiltered, in a way that felt rare. It lingered, settling somewhere deep, reshaping everything I thought I understood about her. I stayed there, caught in the stillness, aware that something had changed in a way that couldn't be undone. The life I had known, the distance, the control, the quiet suppression, felt further away than ever. And in its place, something new had begun. Thoughts of what lay ahead began to settle in quietly, threading themselves through the fragile calm that followed. The reality of daylight, of polished offices and measured distance, stood in sharp contrast to what had unfolded in the privacy of night. There would be roles to play again, expressions to control, lines to redraw in front of everyone else. Yet beneath that surface, something unspoken would remain, something alive and impossible to undo. She seemed to sense the shift before I could name it. There was a quiet satisfaction in the way she held me closer, as if she already understood the duality we would have to carry. Her presence, once distant and untouchable, now felt grounding in a way that softened the uncertainty building inside me. The reassurance in her voice, low and steady, eased the hesitation I hadn't even realized I was holding on to. By the time dawn filtered through the wide windows, casting pale light across the room, everything felt altered. The world I had known, structured, restrained, carefully controlled, no longer fit the same way. Something had been set into motion, something that would not retreat back into silence. The days that followed unfolded like a careful performance. Every morning, I stepped back into the role I had perfected, composed and attentive, the same diligent assistant moving through schedules and tasks with precision. The layers returned, the careful presentation of who I was meant to be. Across the office, she remained unchanged to everyone else. Sharp, commanding, every inch the leader they both feared and admired. No one noticed the shift. To them, nothing had changed. Conversations continued, meetings unfolded, her authority remained absolute. But beneath it all, something burned quietly, hidden behind glances that lingered just a fraction too long, behind silences that carried more meaning than words ever could. Outside the office, the distance dissolved. Moss would arrive without warning, brief and deliberate, pulling me back into her world the moment the day allowed it. Behind closed doors, the restraint we maintained so carefully would unravel, replaced by something far more intense. There was a confidence in her now when it came to me, a certainty that drew out reactions I couldn't fully control. Every small response, every flicker of emotion seemed to amuse her in a way that made it impossible to remain unaffected. What once felt like isolation began to shift. The emptiness that had followed me for years was no longer as heavy, replaced instead by anticipation, by the quiet knowledge that I was no longer entirely alone in my own world. Still, the reality of what we were doing lingered at the edges, a constant awareness of the risk, the impossibility of it all. Moments in the office became charged in ways no one else could see. A glance across a crowded room could ignite a memory. A simple exchange of documents could carry an undercurrent that left my thoughts scattered long after. I learned quickly how to steady myself, how to maintain composure even when everything inside me shifted. Even in solitude, I could feel the change. Sitting alone with a cup of coffee, reflecting on everything that had unfolded, I realized how far I had come from the version of myself who only knew how to imagine. What once lived safely in thought had crossed into something real, something that carried weight and consequence. There were quieter moments too, ones that slipped through the intensity without warning. A small gesture, unexpected and thoughtful, offered without explanation. It stayed with me longer than anything else. A reminder that beneath everything else, there was something genuine beginning to take shape. The balance between public restraint and private truth became a rhythm. Days filled with discipline, nights shaped by something far less controlled. It was exhausting in its own way, yet impossible to step away from closest calls began to weave themselves into that rhythm, each one a sharp reminder of how fragile everything was. A fleeting touch in a hallway, quickly disguised. A moment in an elevator cut short by unexpected company. Each time the tension lingered long after, leaving behind a mix of fear and something far more dangerous. And yet, those risks only deepened everything. There were nights when the intensity gave way to something softer. Conversations that stretched beyond the surface, revealing pieces of her I had never expected to see. The weight she carried, the solitude that came with her position, the quiet truths hidden beneath her carefully constructed exterior. In those moments, the distance between us faded completely. What we had built existed in contrast to everything around it. A hidden world shaped by secrecy, by tension, by something that refused to be defined easily. It was fragile and powerful all at once, something that could unravel with a single misstep, yet felt impossible to walk away from. Back in the office, I remained who I had always appeared to be. Focused, composed, quietly efficient. She remained untouchable, her presence commanding every room she entered. No one saw beyond that surface, but I did, and that knowledge changed everything. In private, what existed between us found its own rhythm, one that balanced her natural authority with something far softer, something that unfolded only when no one else was there to witness it. She still carried that quiet control, guiding every moment with a confidence that drew reactions from me I couldn't always hide. Yet it was never just that. Beneath it, there was care, something steady and growing, revealed in the gentler ways she held me close once the intensity settled. What had once been uncertainty inside me began to shift into something deeper. Feelings no longer lingered unspoken. They surfaced in quiet confessions, in the stillness after everything else had faded, where words felt more honest and less guarded. The connection between us expanded beyond fleeting moments, taking shape in ways neither of us could ignore. We learned how to exist within the spaces we were given. Meetings turned into walks beneath open skies, conversations stretching beyond work into something more personal. Even the smallest gestures carried meaning, hands brushing, eyes meeting, silence speaking where words could not. The world outside blurred in those moments, leaving only the quiet certainty that we were no longer standing on separate sides of something undefined. There were evenings that felt almost ordinary, though nothing about them truly was. Cooking together, sharing laughter that echoed through her once silent space, discovering ease in places where tension had once lived. It was in those simple moments that something real took root, something that didn't rely on secrecy or intensity to exist. Outside, the balance remained delicate. At work, everything was measured, every glance controlled, every word chosen carefully. But beneath that surface, something constant pulsed quietly. reminding me that what we shared hadn't disappeared. It had simply learned to hide. There were close calls that tested that balance, moments where the line between public and private blurred dangerously. A step too close, a gesture that lingered too long, the sudden presence of someone else forcing distance back into place. Each time, the risk sharpened everything, leaving behind a rush that was equal parts fear, and something far more difficult to name. Yet even with that risk, there were moments of calm, times when the world seemed to pause long enough for us to simply exist without pretense. Conversations that stretched late into the night, revealing pieces of ourselves that had been buried under years of expectation and solitude. In those moments, her strength softened, and the distance she held from everyone else dissolved completely. What we were building no longer felt fragile. It carried weight now, something grounded in more than fleeting emotion. Even in the quiet, even in the uncertainty, there was a sense that this wasn't something temporary. When the company gala arrived, it felt like everything had been leading toward it. The room shimmered with light and movement, filled with voices and celebration. She stood at the center of it all, composed and commanding, exactly as everyone expected her to be. I remained where I always had been in that world, present, observant, careful. But beneath it, something had already changed. Every glance we shared carried more than it should have. Every step felt like it was leading toward something inevitable. The distance we maintained began to feel thinner, harder to hold in place. When the moment finally came, it unfolded with the same certainty she brought to everything else. No hesitation, no doubt. Just a quiet decision made real in front of everyone. The reaction moved through the room like a wave, surprise, curiosity, and then something warmer. Acceptance came more easily than I had expected, carried by the same admiration people already held for her. What had once been hidden no longer needed to stay that way. For the first time, there was no need to step back, no need to pretend. Everything that followed felt lighter, as if something long held in place had finally been released. Conversations shifted, glances softened, the atmosphere around us changing in ways that made the world feel more open than it ever had before. Back in the quiet of her home, the intensity returned, but it carried something different now. No longer defined by secrecy, it felt grounded, real in a way that didn't rely on hiding. The connection between us had deepened into something steady, something that extended beyond moments and into something lasting. In the days that followed, the world adjusted around us. Where there had once been distance, there was now openness. Where there had been tension, there was ease. The life I had once known, guarded, restrained, quietly distant, felt like something far behind me. What remained was something new, something undeniable.